but may be coming out this week, and a more extensive written order may be coming from the judge.
The second question I have is, and your office undoubtedly has handled many appeals that have gone up to the Ninth Circuit. How fast can the Ninth Circuit get involved in this if the Justice Department puts together papers quickly seeking to stay or postpone enforcement of the judge's ruling? I mean, could they be in action tomorrow seeking relief from the Ninth Circuit and preventing it from applying to the entire nation? What's your opinion on that?
I think that's possible. It's a question best directed to them of how they want to proceed. But obviously, as I've said from the beginning, before we received this opinion, this decision from Judge Robart, that I expected win, lose, or draw, that this thing was going to move fairly quickly through up to the Ninth Circuit, just because of the magnitude of the executive order. And whichever way the judge went, I anticipate there'd be an appeal relatively soon. But really, it's up for the federal government to decide. But it would not surprise me if we found ourselves before the Ninth Circuit relatively soon. That said, I feel confident that we'll prevail when this does go up to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals.
Attorney General Ferguson, just my last question. Just for you on a personal basis, when you heard the judge's ruling, I mean, as somebody who, brought this case, who argued this, you've been living this now for the past week at the very least, what did you think? What went through your mind? Were you surprised?
It's hard to put into words, to be honest with you, Anderson. I guess I was very proud of my team. They've literally worked around the clock for the past 6 days, and I mean that quite literally. Attorneys have been in my office around the clock for 6 days to make this happen. So, as a lawyer, it's why you go to law school, right? To do something that benefits the people you serve, and that upholds the rule of law and the Constitution. So, to say it was the best day of my professional life would be an understatement.
And to those who, supported the executive order and say that they felt safer after the executive order, what do you say?
What I say is we're a nation of laws, Anderson, right? And I understand that sentiment. But things have to be done in accordance with our Constitution. That is the bottom line, and is central to who we are as a people. And the President simply did not meet that obligation, which is central to his responsibilities, and one, to be crystal clear, as we wrap up, I will hold him to throughout his administration, frankly in the same way that I filed 2 lawsuits against the Obama administration when I felt they were acting in an unlawful fashion, and we prevailed in the first and are litigating the second. That's my duty and my responsibility as a lawyer and as Attorney General for the people of this state.
I do have one more question for you. This is from David Gergen, who's standing by.
Mr. Attorney General, help us, sir, understand, if the Ninth Circuit were to reverse, will you then appeal to the Supreme Court?
Oh, I'm prepared, David, for this case to go all the way to the Supreme Court, whichever way the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals goes. It's a case of that magnitude. It's a case that, frankly, I think will ultimately end up before the U.S. Supreme Court. And so that would not surprise me one way or the other if we end up before the U.S. Supreme Court.
Well, Mr. Attorney General, we do appreciate your time. I know it's been a very busy night for you. I appreciate that. I want to go now to the White House and see Jim Acosta. Jim, any public reaction? What are your sources telling you?
Not yet, Anderson. We do know that the White House is aware of this ruling out in Washington State. We understand that a statement could be coming, that they're working on a statement, but no word yet as to when that is going to come. But we should point out the Trump administration is very confident that this is going to hold up in court. The Office of Legal Counsel with the Trump administration put out a guidance saying that they felt that this executive order was legal. But keep in mind, from a legal standpoint, this has been very controversial all week. You'll recall the acting Attorney General, Sally Yates, was fired personally by the president because she would not carry out this order, and she found that it was not legal. And so once again, you may have a situation this weekend, Anderson, where this is all sort of up in the air legally, and you might have, again, chaos and confusion at these airports because you may have people in some of these countries wanting to figure out, well, can they come to the United States? And so my guess is that we're going to get a statement from the White House and we're going to get some kind of guidance from Homeland Security as to whether or not people can get on planes and come to the United States. My sense of it is that it's unlikely that that's going to happen. But once again, we're sort of in this legal limbo as to what is going to happen with this very controversial executive order.
We should point out, Jim, in terms of people getting on planes coming to the United States, those would only be people who already had a visa, who had already been approved, and then had those visas, I guess, rescinded would be the word, if I'm not incorrect. This is not new people who are suddenly going to be applying for a visa which in many of these countries, and in practically all, I think in all the countries in this this ban, it takes many weeks and or months to actually get a visa.
That's right. That's right. And that was part of the reason why the Trump administration brought this forward. They wanted extreme vetting. They wanted tighter vetting practices for people coming from these 7 predominantly Muslim countries. But at the same time, what we saw over the weekend, where you had Iraqi interpreters who worked with the U.S. military, where you had green card holders and so on, there was just so much confusion with the rollout of this. You had so many Republicans up on Capitol Hill who have been pretty supportive of this president all along, scratching their heads and saying, hey, wait a minute, this was just not handled properly. And so, with this ruling, this temporary restraining order out in Washington State, I would imagine the White House is going to act fairly quickly here to get this appealed, because this could once again result in some chaos and confusion over the weekend.
All right, Jim Acosta, no doubt we'll be checking with you throughout these next 2 hours and into the evening. We've put together our own legal dream team. Here, as you've seen, CNN legal analyst Laura Coates is joining us from Washington. Jeff Toobin is on the phone. Harvard constitutional, David Gergen and our other political analysts are here as well. Is Professor Turley here? Do I have that right? Is he here? Nobody? All right. Jeff Toobin is on the phone. All right. Jeff Toobin, let's start off with you.
Yes, sir.
What do you make of this? Are you surprised?
Well, I am surprised at the nationwide aspect of it. But this is not unprecedented even recently. It's important to remember that during the Obama administration, a federal district court judge in Texas ended President Obama's attempt to protect the Dreamers, the people who were brought to the United States as children. That executive order was overturned on a national basis by a federal district judge in Texas, and that was the end of it. The federal appeals court, the Fifth Circuit, upheld that, and the Supreme Court never had a chance to act on it. That is precisely what's happened here. A federal district judge in Washington has said this is an unconstitutional act, but we are now at only the middle stages of a long legal drama. This is very likely to go to the Ninth Circuit this weekend, and it is undoubtedly going to wind up in the Supreme Court. One other fact to keep in mind, though, is that this executive order is something of a moving target. What it means has not been clear. And just on the question, for example, of whether it applies to people with green cards, the administration is now saying it doesn't after it appeared that it did. So how the courts rule on it will in part be affected by what it means, because even that is just not clear at this point.
But I mean, I thought the White House tried to clarify that this did not apply to green card holders.
Well, they did try to clarify that, but that the order says what it says, and it has to be evaluated in terms of of what it says. And we now have reports that there are tens of thousands of visas that are now in jeopardy because of this. And just in a very practical sense, I have a great deal of sympathy for the people at the airports, whether they are with the Immigration Service or with Homeland Security, trying to interpret what to do in their jobs. Today, because this executive order is currently no longer the law of the land. But what does that mean for people standing on line at airports? I think, there's going to have to be some guidance sent to them very quickly, and we don't have, and none has been forthcoming yet, which is not surprising since this order came down about a half an hour ago.
I want to also bring in Harvard University's Lawrence Tribe. Professor Tribe, your thoughts on what has happened, what it means, and what happens next.
Asking me a question, I didn't hear it.
Professor Tribe, just your thoughts on what has happened tonight and also what happens next.
Well, what happened tonight was historic and very important, and I do think that clarification is in order. First of all, the court held, against the arguments of the Attorney General of the United States, or at least the Justice Department, that the states of Minnesota and Washington had standing to represent universities affected by this unconstitutional order. Secondly, the only practical impact of what the judge did would have to be the reinstatement of the 60 to 100,000 visas that were arbitrarily and secretly canceled at the same time that the matter was pending before the courts. I mean, that's one of the more extraordinary things. Lawyers were in court arguing that people detained. The government pretended that that was a trivial matter. It was 107 people. And behind the back of the court, arguably in contempt, what they did was to suspend without hearings, without notice to the people involved, or without notice to the public or to the lawyers involved. They just canceled the visas, purported to cancel them. What this judge did clearly has got to mean those cancelled. But airlines may be confused about what it means in terms of people trying to board those planes to come back to the United States from the 7 blacklisted countries. The individuals involved may be afraid to get on the planes because they don't know if they'll be allowed to get off. I think that the attorneys general of Minnesota and Washington should ask the judge for immediate clarification, and I hope he will clarify that the visas are just as good as they were before this void by the Trump administration was issued.
Right. From what we heard from the Attorney General in Washington tonight, this was a verbal ruling by the judge. They are awaiting either a short written judgment and a longer one perhaps this weekend. But just in terms of the timing, Professor Tribe, I mean, if the Department of Justice decides to bring this to the Ninth Circuit, how quickly can they go about doing that and get a ruling?
If I had a crystal ball, I would be hesitant to whip it out for this purpose. It's pretty clear that the moves that are next made could be by the Trump administration, or they could be by the states of Minnesota and Washington, asking the court in the process of reducing its oral ruling to something written and clear to make exactly clear what it means for visa holders who are in a kind of unjust and unconstitutional limbo at the moment.
Jeffrey Toobin, do you have a sense of how quickly things can move forward?
Oh, they could go really fast, Anderson. I mean, they could go over the weekend. When I say that, they can ask for emergency relief over the weekend. There's no guarantee they'll get it, but certainly the Justice Department can be in court tonight asking the Ninth Circuit to overturn this stay. Remember also that the Ninth Circuit is one of the more liberal circuits where the opponents of this executive order are very likely to have a better chance than in, say, the Fifth Circuit, which ruled against the Obama's immigration plan. So it is not a guarantee that just because the Justice Department gets back into court that they will win. There is, many judges have already shown deep reservations about this executive order. So it doesn't mean just because the Justice Department asks for this to be reversed that it will be.
Laura Coates, was any of this argument that was made to the judge in Washington, was any of it affected by the then acting Attorney General giving instructions? I guess it was last Friday. I think it was Friday, or I don't know. It all blends together. Or Monday. To Department of Justice lawyers not to defend this. She was then fired that night and replaced. Would the government's ability to have argued this been affected by that at all?
It would have been, because you have to have a consistent kind of party line here of what we're going to be arguing in courts going forward as to how to defend this. And the incoming acting AG, Bente, when he said he was going to go ahead and defend it, had to put forth arguments that could be used universally. But remember, people have to remember, a few hours before this Washington ruling happened, in Massachusetts, a court ruled exactly the opposite. They found that the government was likely to prevail in the same sort of context, and that people didn't even have a property right to a visa, and that they were going to not extend the temporary injunction that was given to people through Sunday. So this case is not only possibly going to go to the Supreme Court, it is guaranteed to, because you're going to have a conflict between two circuits. The Ninth and the West Coast, very liberal, versus the First Circuit. So you have competing arguments, and you better believe if the DOJ goes into court this weekend before the Ninth Circuit, they're going to have in their hand the 21-page ruling from that Massachusetts court, in contrast to the oral opinion and oral statement given by the judge today saying, excuse me, this is actually not a guarantee that they will prevail in court. We actually might. And the number one reason they gave, Anderson, is the presidential prerogative to be able to have great deference to say who can come in the country when national security is an issue. This is a really, really difficult case still.
I also want to bring our panelists here, Paul Callan, who you heard from earlier, Danny Savalas as well, Maggie Haberman from the New York Times, David Gergen, Ron Brownstein as well. I think the bottom line for a lot of people watching overseas and wondering in the United States of all political stripes is what actually, beyond the court battle that looms ahead, what does this actually mean for all those people who thought they had visas, then were told their visas were no longer valid? At this stage, until we hear from, I guess, immigration, customs enforcement, we don't really know.
It's less a legal question and more of an administrative type question because, as Paul pointed out earlier, all we have at this point is an oral order from the bench that's sort of relayed to us by the litigants. We haven't seen any paper yet. And this is a government not only of laws, but of paper. And they're going to need that paper to enact or carry through on any judge's order. Right now, all of this order is apocryphal.
You know, Anderson, I think people would be foolish to jump on airplanes to come to the United States when over the weekend this order could be reversed. And although everybody has said things like this have happened before, it's very, very rare. Usually in the federal courts, we like to have these things percolate up and the Supreme Court likes to see how the different districts and circuits are handling a major issue before laying down the law of the land. So I think this is going to be in flux and people shouldn't move precipitously.
But the Texas analogy, I think, is very apt here. I mean, this is really the inverse of what we saw so often in the Obama administration, where you saw state attorney generals led by Texas going to court in conservative courts, district courts in Texas, knowing that it would then go up through the Fifth Circuit. That was a conservative court, and it was, I don't believe it was not the dreamers themselves, it was their parents, it was the adults. It was President Obama's attempt to extend the protection to adults who were here in an undocumented status that was blocked by the district court, upheld by the Fifth Circuit, and then reached a dead end at the Supreme Court. Now here, you know, you have the possibility of the Ninth Circuit, which is, I believe, is the most Democratic appointed, about 2-to-1, potentially upholding and then again hitting a tied Supreme Court. And I guess the question, first of all, this is very indicative of how our politics is changing. As president, you're not only fighting the other party in Congress in kind of a horizontal way, you have a vertical fight where the other party pursues you again from the states. Very clear pattern under President Obama, clearly replicated here under President Trump. The question will be, for the legal side, if you have this struck down by one circuit, by one appellate court and upheld by another and a tied Supreme Court, what happens then?
You know, that's a fascinating question, because if the Ninth Circuit rules against the Trump administration, it goes to the Supreme Court. The Ninth Circuit's ruling will be the first one that gets there. That would become technically the law of the land. So people are going to come to realize very quickly, having a 4-4 split ideologically on the Supreme Court as we currently do can have a big impact on the nation.
And speaking of splits, I mean, this is exactly the kind of thing that the Supreme Court looks for in deciding to take cases. So you'll have not only a circuit split, but a simultaneous circuit split, which is really something amazing.
Yeah, Paul, what are the options for the Supreme Court? What are the different options the country might be looking at?
Well, I think the Supreme Court, before the Supreme Court decides this, one option is that the Trump administration will take a second look at redrafting this executive order. I would think that from a pragmatic standpoint, that would be the way for them to approach it. Now, if it gets to the Supreme Court, it's interesting because Anthony Kennedy is a swing vote on the Supreme Court. He could go over onto the side of people who are considered to be more liberal and rule against the Obama administration. So it's going to be really hard to predict how this plays out in the Supreme Court ultimately.
What a mess.
But I just think incredibly indicative of how divided. I mean, this is what we saw. You know, in the 1990s, you did not see John Engler and Tommy Thompson suing Bill Clinton all the time. It became routine under President Obama, where he was fighting not only the Republicans in Congress, but essentially every Republican attorney general sued him on the Medicaid expansion, on the DACA expansion to the parents, and on the Clean Power Plan, and would find a conservative court, run it up through a conservative appellate review, and then either the Supreme Court would stalemate or not take it. Now we are seeing it again. It really just shows you how in many functional ways, we are talking about a functional civil war between blue and red America.
Another thing that should scare us all, though, Mr. Trump put a picture of Andrew Jackson up in the Oval Office recently. Well, in 1832, in a case called Worcester versus Georgia, the court, John Marshall, ruled against Andrew Johnson, and he stated, Jackson stated, Marshall has issued his opinion, now let him enforce it. And it almost led to a constitutional crisis in the United States when Jackson refused to go along with the decision.
That is one thing they will not do. I cannot believe the Trump administration will say we'll ignore this. I think they'll say tonight they're very confident they're going to prevail in the end.
I hope so.
And Maggie, we do expect that we would get some word from the White House tonight. I mean, if we know President Trump at all, they are quick to react. They are, if they're punched, they like to counterpunch quickly. So.
They're quick to react and they like to counterpunch quickly, but they also have gotten a bit dinged up over the last week and a half for moving a little quickly without necessarily checking everything. So I think they're going to be a little more thorough than we have seen since he took office in responding to this.
And as I said, we are waiting for a response from the White House as well as other authorities. We're going to take a quick break. We'll have more on this dramatic decision ahead.